Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I welcome you to the 30th lecture of the course Management, Organizational Policies and Practices. So far during this course we have discussed a number of management topics in great detail. We have also discussed the different organizational policies and practices, the different compliance issues, the different laws and legislations with respect to some of the sessions, some of the lectures, and we have discussed the history of management. We have discussed the organizational structure, the strategic management issues. We have discussed a number of other human resource management issues, a few human resource development issues. We also discussed in one or two lectures about the human resource development issues, and that how the managers, they need to handle them, because when we talk about the management, then it covers all the different aspects of management, of managing employees, of managing resources, operations, of managing all the different functions in the organization, right? So we discussed all these different areas in greater detail. What we have done so far is we have covered almost all the topics on management very comprehensively, and as I told you earlier in my earlier sessions, in my first session, that we have used a couple of books to prepare these lectures, and I would also recommend you to take help from a number of reference books. Such as I told you that for general management, you can have a look at the book of Chuck Williams. Then we have this strategic human resource management, which is by Boxall and Purcell. That is a good reference book. And there is another book named Organizational Management and Behavior, or only Organizational Behavior, which is by Judge and Robinsons, I think. So that can also be a very helpful book, wherein you can study a number of topics which are related to managing the leadership styles, the motivation issues, and the conflict management, and the negotiations, how to deal with the negotiations, and then we also have the power politics, right, and the stress management. So all this kind of topics, then the behavior management, the attitudes management, the decision making, individual decision making, perceptions, all these different topics you can get from the book named Organizational Behavior, which is by Judge and Robinsons. That is by Judge, and the other colleague is, I think, Robinsons. So you can also Google the book and the other books, and you can get them online, or you can get a hard copy of those books and get your course prepared from these books. So they are the main books, but other than that, as I told you, you can also you can also use some other books, and you can prepare these topics from some other books as well. There is no, of course, they are not textbooks, right? Okay, so what we are going to do now is that we are going to have a detailed overview of what we have done so far. So we are done with 29 lectures till now, and in those 29 lectures we covered 29 different topics in the area of management. And now for the next sessions, what we'll be doing is that we'll be covering the key aspects of all those sessions, the important aspects from all those sessions. We'll be covering them in today's session and in the upcoming session. So I will be giving you an overview, a recap, and the important points, to which you specifically need to take care of and prepare, or the important points of these lectures. I'll be going through those points again for this session and for the next sessions, by breaking up our 29 lectures into 3 steps or 3 stages. Okay, so we started off with what management is, and that constituted our first lecture, which was Introduction to Management. So which was about that what managers are, what do they perform, what are their functions, what are the expectations from the managers. and we discussed the managers, they perform 4 functions. The traditional managers, they perform 4 functions. That was the traditional view of managers. One was the planning, the other one was the organizing people and processes, and the other one was the leading and the controlling, right? So they performed these 4 functions. That was the traditional view of management. That is, they need to plan their activities, they need to organize the people, they need to design their work, right? And who has to do what work, how people will be assigned, right? So all this, what work has to be taken from home, what will be the chain of command, and stuff like that. So we discussed that all these topics in the organizing function are performed by the managers. And we also discussed that the managers, they're also involved in the processes, organizing the processes, right? Like what routine will be followed, how the tasks will be done, right? And what sequence will the processes take, right? And what will be done before and what will be done after. So these are all the different processes, and organizing these processes, organizing these people, that is the second function of management. Then leading is the next function of the managers. The managers need to be good motivators. They need to be leaders. For the leaders, they need to instill the vision in the people, and they need to change, they need to address the attitudes of the people, and so that the people, they start identifying with the organization, and they start identifying with the goals of the organization, and they start idealizing the leader, right? And the vision of the organization is instilled in the people. So that is what is the leader's role, that to motivate people to do certain tasks and to fulfill organizational goals, even if they have to go beyond their personal agendas and their personal goals. So they basically bypass their personal goals and they identify more with the organizational goals and put an effort to achieve those goals. So leading is a very important function of the managers. And then controlling, whatever the policies and processes that are in place in the organization according to the planning that you have done, and that planning is in line with the strategy that the organization has developed, you need to control your activities. And by controlling, we also mean the evaluation. So that is a function, very important function, and that is performed by the managers, that how they have to control the behaviors of the people when they have established procedures and the processes, and when they have designed the work for the people, right? And the people, they have been told, they have been inculcated that this is the vision and this is the goal of the organization, and this is the work they have to perform, and this is how they have to perform. And after that, whether that work is done that way, whether the activities and the processes are in place or not, that is the control function. So the control function is also handled by the managers as the next stage. Right, if we know that if the proper controls are not in place, then it's difficult for the organization to fix the problems, right? And if the problems occur, then those problems, they cannot be fixed. And if the control function is weak, then maybe a minute problem, it turns into a very big problem before it is corrected. So if there is effective control function at all steps or at the various steps, and the managers, they are committed to this control function, and they are really active about this, and they are actively seeking if there are any drawbacks, or if there are any loopholes, or if there are any deficits in the performance of the people or in the processes, right? So the managers, their commitment is important, and the effectiveness of the control function is important. Otherwise, the small losses, they can turn into huge losses for the organization. But if the corrective action is there, if the corrective measures are there, and if the mechanism is there that can identify that there needs to be some corrections, or the organizational policies, they are not being implemented in the right way, and the desired behaviors are not being achieved, or they are not being performed, then the corrective action can be taken immediately, and the major issues can be the smaller issues can be stopped from turning into major issues and the major losses, right? So they are the traditional functions of the management, but other than that, we know that the managers, they are also performing the global functions, such as the global, they're managing globally, right? And we know that the world has become a global village, and as a result of the increased cost globalization and market globalization, wherein the costs have merged internationally, and the products are being produced the world over, and the countries and the multinationals, they are bringing in their manufacturing units to the cheaper parts of the world, such as India and China, wherein they can make use of the cheaper raw material and other cheaper services, the IT services, and the the labor costs, they're very cheap. Therefore, as that is posing a competition and a challenge for the competitors of the firms also to start producing in the low cost areas and the low cost regions, and as a result, it is giving rise to cost globalization. And similarly, the market globalization is there because of the changing trends and the changing convergence in the tastes of the customers and the consumers, and as a result, the market is now becoming the same globally, such as the market for jeans, the market for coffee, right? The market for chips, potatoes. The market for Coke. So it is these products, their demand has become very much international, that is global, that is not specific to one part of the world anymore. So, right, so as a result of that, as a result of the convergence in the taste of the customers, there is again a challenge for the managers, that how they have to operate in this global world, how they have to manage themselves in the global world when their competitors have become global. Then, of course, we know that as a result of the e-commerce and the distributors, they are being bypassed, and many companies, they are offering their services online. It's possible to place orders not directly online from the stores and get them delivered, right? And we have the example of the Amazon.com, we have the example of eBay, right? And this all has a challenge for the managers, and the managers, that is one of the functions in the contemporary styles of management. That is one of the functions that the managers, they need to perform, that how they have to go global. And then the innovation and change, of course, that is an other management function in the contemporary theory of management, which says that the managers, they need to be innovative, and they need to be adaptive to change, and they need to make their organizations innovative and adaptive to change because of the changing requirements, because of the changes we were just talking about under the head of the global management, that how the markets, they have become global, and how there are new challenges for the organizations, and as a result of that, the managers, they need to take steps to make their organizations innovative and more adaptive. We discussed the old versus new styles of management, right? Then we had a discussion about the kinds of managers. We discussed that there are the top managers, there are the middle managers, there are the first line managers, and there are the team leaders. And we had a discussion that these different managers, they perform different functions at all the different levels, right? We discussed that the top managers, they basically are responsible for making the strategy of the organization. So the corporate strategy is formed by the top managers, right? And after the top managers, they collect the necessary information, they scan the environment from the external organization, external macro environment, and then they also scan the internal environment of the organization, and they collect some data, and they have some aspirations and some ideas and beliefs that how they want their organization to be. And as a result, on the basis of certain assumptions that they have about the organization, and on the basis of the data that they collect from the external and the internal market, they develop the strategy of the organization. And of course, these top managers, they're responsible for developing the strategy of the organization, although these top managers, they also get feedback from the from the other levels in the management, and it is encouraged that they involve all levels of managers and the employees also in the strategy development process. Then the middle managers, they are basically responsible for making the so the top managers, they formulate the vision and the mission for the organization as well, and they formulate the strategy and the vision and the mission. So they develop the vision and mission, and on the basis of that, the strategy is developed. And the middle-level managers, they it means that the long-term goals are set by the long-term vision and the long-term goals are set by the top managers, and the middle managers, they set the intermediate goals. Right? They call meetings with that. They are basically responsible for implementing the strategies, for making sure that the strategies by the top management, they have been implemented by the first-line managers at the lower level. So the middle level managers, they basically make intermediate plans which are neither very long ranging plans, not short term plans such as that of 1 year, but they are ranging from 3 to 5 years, and they basically call meetings with the employees at the lower levels, and the first line managers, they are reportable to the middle managers on how they are implementing the strategy of the organization, what plans they have made and what policies they have made. So they make sure that the strategy is being implemented at the line manager level, right? And they call meetings, and through the management by objectives, they set the targets and the goals, mutually set targets and goals together with the employees, and then have periodic feedback from the employees on whether the goals they have been met or not. The first line managers, they are basically, they make we know that they are they are basically directly they have to supervise the employees, and the employees are accountable, or the employees are reportable to these first line managers. Right, and these first line managers, they basically are as we discussed, that they are responsible for forming the short term goals for the company, and implementation of those goals. They need to make sure that the employees are performing well. They need to keep a check on the performances of the employees. They need to evaluate the performances of the employees, and the other human resource activities, they're also being performed by the first line managers, right? While the team leaders, they are basically team leaders, they're not managers, right? But they do not perform the HR functions that the first line managers perform, right? But the team leaders, they are just the facilitators of the performance of the team. They try to make sure that there is good coordination between the team, and there is good interaction between the team. There is good communication between the team. The conflict does not arise between the team and so they basically are only the facilitators between the team members, right? And they make sure that the team members have enough resources to get the tasks done that they have been given, right? So team leaders, they don't have any HR function to perform, but they're just the facilitators, and they're not responsible for the outcomes of the team, right? They're not solely responsible. Of course, the team on the whole is responsible for the outcomes of the team. Then we discussed that the managers, they perform a number of roles, such as the interpersonal role, wherein they are dealing with the number of people, then the informational role, wherein they are getting information and disseminating that information, and they also play this decisional role, making the decisions. There are 4 types of skills that have been reported to be important, such as the technical skills to perform the task, the human skills for the good relations with the others, the conceptual skills, the ability to look as a whole, the different functions that are being performed. So that is very important, that you should have those conceptual skills as a manager. Then the motivation to manage is important, of course, to get things done, and a motivation to communicate, and motivation to get things done, right? That is important, another important skill that the managers need to have, right? Then we discussed a number of mistakes that the managers commonly make. We also discussed the first year of management transition, that how managers, they have the at the beginning, what are their expectations, then after one year passes, how they perceive the job of the management, and after 5 years, how do their perceptions about what management is changes, right? Then we had a discussion during our second lecture on how the strategy is developed, right? And we basically discussed two concepts. One was the intended strategy and the other one was the emergent strategy. And with respect to the intended strategy, we discussed that how intended strategy is basically a planned strategy, and we had a discussion that the intended strategy deals with the proper documentation and proper augmentation and a written statement of what the organization wants and how that will be achieved, right? So in what direction it wants to go, what would be its line of business, who will be its target market, who will be customers, and etc. So a number of these points they are discussed in the intended strategy, and it is a planned activity, right? And it is prepared at the top, at the CEO level, and we discussed that how the intended strategy is developed, right? We also discussed a number of bottlenecks that why the intended strategy remains to a large extent unimplemented in the organizations, right? And we discussed that since in the intended strategy development process, there are we discussed that all the managers, they are asked to develop their the strategies for their business units, and then the corporate, they move to the corporate level, and at the corporate level, when those documents are combined and after the revisions being made by the managers, the final document emerges, and that is the strategy of the organization. And so the final we also discussed that there are a number of processes that are used to develop this intended strategy, such as the companies, they can also take the help of the consultants to develop this strategy. They can also conduct these strategy workshops in which they can take insights, or they can take the participation of the other employees and the other groups of the organization for development of this strategy, right? But it is basically based on a number of assumptions. This strategy on that the top management has, on a number of aspirations of the top management, right? And on a number of assumptions, on the number of the history, how the organization has been doing in the history, and just without changing those what has been happening in the past, the managers, they keep going on and developing their strategy in the future as well, basing on the historic trends, right? So, we discussed that what is the harm in this intended strategy is that one, it is a little bit inflexible, because everything is jotted down in this strategy, and sometimes even what has been stated in this strategy is not well communicated to the employees. That only remains in the books, right? But what happens is that this strategy remains unimplemented because one, it does not really consider the input from the employees at the down floor, at the shop floor level, who are in direct competition, who are in direct liaison with their customers, and who have the direct knowledge of what are the real issues and how those issues can be addressed, and how the strategy of the organization can be improved, and how the changes can be brought about. Because the shop floor workers, they are the people who are dealing with a number of customers, and who know better that what the customer demands, right, and how the customer can be satisfied, or what are the changes in the products or the services that need to be made. So the commitment of the employees, that remains very low when they're not involved in the strategy development process, and when they feel that the things that have been said by the organization, they are only in paper, and they are not really implementable in practice as well, because the actual needs and they are different from what has been stated there. So because the top management does not have the orientation with the actual problems at the ground floor or at the shop floor, right? So that is why the intended strategy, we discussed that it is not always successful, and it tends to remain unimplemented to a large extent. On the emergent strategy, on the other hand, we discussed that how the emergent strategy is very much it is more practical and it is more implemented in the organization, and large part of the emergent strategy that becomes realized because it develops at the shop floor from the lower level employees. There is flexibility and there is adaptability to change in the strategy, right? And the shop floor workers, they can mold their processes, their designs, their work designs, and they can respond to the customers' demands and to the customers' orders. They can customize according to that, and they can deal with the because they have this much discretion and autonomy to deal with those orders of the customers, and to bring some changes in as per the changes in the external environment. So the emergent strategy is more responsive to the changes in the external environment compared to the intended strategy, which is really fixed, right? That is the reason why the emergent strategy is more successful. We identified intended process strategy development in organizations, including the role of vision and command, strategic planning systems, and externally imposed strategies, right? And we discussed the importance of this externally imposed strategy when we were discussing the intended strategy processes. So we discussed that it's not only consultants, it's not only the projects, the project groups, but it also a number of other factors, such as the strategy can be externally imposed as well, and such as in the case of the Security and Exchange Commission of Pakistan, that is imposing certain regulations on the banks, right, and other corporate bodies, and which affects which influences or which formulates the strategy of those organizations, right? So they are the externally imposed strategies wherein you, as a company, it cannot do anything and you have to follow that strategy, right? And then we also identified a number of emergent strategy development processes, such as logical incrementalism, in which you constantly keep on adapting yourself to the incremental changes in the external environment. We also keep on bringing incremental changes in your strategy, right? And as a result, this strategy emerges. And then we also discuss the resource allocation processes, that how the managers, they are only those proposals they are approved from the employees or the lower level managers, which in the direction in which the organization wants to go, right? So if the organization wants to develop new products, then it will be more and more approving the products that are coming from the low level managers or the lower level employees who are in the product development, but it won't be catering to, it will be rejecting the projects that are coming on the market development, for example, right, because it's trying to focus on the product development, right? So this is how so it will be allocating more resources on the product development, and that indicates that how this strategy develops, right? And then we discuss the cultural processes, that how they lead to this emergent strategy development processes, and the organizational politics. We saw that the high level and the middle level managers, especially in the organizations, how they try to safeguard their personal interests, their self-interest, their vested interests, and as a result of that, the more powerful managers and the more political ones, they try to get approved those strategies and those policies and those resources which are in their favor, and as a result, this strategy development occurs as a result of the purely political phenomenon. So that is what it says, right? And then we discussed that how different processes of strategy development may be found in multiple forms and in different contexts, right? So the organizations normally which are dealing in the turbulent environments, they tend to be more focusing on the emergent strategy, because they really need to constantly bring incremental changes and constantly adapt in response to the external environment, right? And therefore they need to have this emergent strategy. In organizations which are more stable in nature, who are operating in stable environments, they are more using this intended strategy, such as Shell is doing, right? And it has very long-term strategic plans for 15-20 years, right? Because there is not much turbulence in that industry. So for example, in the textile industry, there is not, if there is not much turbulence, right, and compared to the IT industry, where there is a lot of increment, there are radical there are innovations in that sector. And as a result, the firms, they need to have the emergent strategy. They need to constantly respond to the external environmental cues, right? We also had a discussion on the importance of vision and mission statements, how they are formulated by getting the information or by getting the vision and mission statements from the managers at their business unit levels, and then how they are combined to make a document after wherein the revisions, unnecessary revisions are made at all the levels of all the managers, right? And then a final document is put into place, and that document is and should be well communicated to all the different stakeholders of the organization. And we also discussed that how these vision and mission statements, they can be a very good way for the organization to describe its image the way it wants to the way it wants to be looked at by the external environment and by all the different stakeholders, right? And we also discussed the number of components and the benefits of the vision and mission statements with the help of examples. Then we had a discussion on the on the external environment, that how the organizations need to scan their external environment and their internal environment, right? So during the lecture 6, which was the lecture 3, which was basically the continuation of the introduction to the strategic management lecture, herein we discussed that when the organization develops the strategy of the organization at the corporate level, then it then it needs to scan the external environment at the time of the strategy development. But it's not only till there, it needs to constantly scan its external environment, and it needs to constantly respond to the changes in the external environment. So the industrial organizational view basically states the same. It says that in order for the firm to remain to gain and sustain the competitive advantage in the industry, it needs to view its macro environment or its external environment, and it needs to develop its strategy according to those environmental factors, right? And we discussed this PESTEL framework. We discussed that there are 3 different layers in the macro environment. When we talk about the macro environment, there are three different layers. The one is the external most layer, right, which is the macro, or which is the most general environment. So they are the forces which are not directly influencing the organization, but they are influencing it indirectly, right? Such as in the PESTEL framework, this most external layer was explained with the help of this PESTEL framework, wherein we discussed the political forces in the political environment, right? And we discussed that how the change in the political government, the political regulations in the country, the political agendas internationally, right, and how they all impose a challenge for the organizations, and how they affect the organization's structure and organization's strategy. So there can be a number of regulations by one political government, and when the political government changes, it completely alters the regulations. For example, on the its trade regulations, it alters the tariffs, it changes its trade policy, it changes its export-import policy, etc., and it has the impact on the organization in return, right? And then we discussed a number of economic factors that have an influence on the organization, the economic and the external environment, the economic factors such as the changes in the inflation rate. So it is not directly to do anything with the organization, but it has this is the change in the external environment at the macro level, and it is going to ultimately affect the organization. The changes in the interest rates, right? And then the other economic conditions such as the recessions or the boom, how it influences the consumer, the customer's value, and how then it ultimately influences the organization. Then we discussed a number of social factors such as the changes in the lifestyles of the people, and the changes in the tastes of the consumers, and more consumerism, etc., how they are influencing the organizations. Then we discussed that the technological environment or the technological factors, they are also very big players in the macro environment that influence the organization. The changes in the technology, how fast the changes are in the technology, what are the policies of the government vis-a-vis the transfer of technology, right? And what is the rate of obsolescence of the products, what is the rate of the transfer of new technology in the country, right? And how much the government is investing in R&D, how much is the government is supporting R&D. So all these different aspects, they are coming under this technological aspect, and they are influencing the organization at the macro level. Right, and then we also discussed the number of environmental factors, that how they influence the organization, the different environmental laws and the environmental regulations, right? Their influences on the organization, and we discussed the legal factors as well that influence the organization, right? The different legal frameworks. Then we had a discussion about the inner layer that the organization faces, which is the industry environment, and we discussed it with the help of the Porter's 5 forces model, right? And we discussed that they are basically this industry is wherein the organization is operating, and they have a direct influence on the organization compared to the macro environment, which is an indirect influence on the organization. The industry environment has direct influence on the organization, and organization can also affect them, the industry environment, directly, right? But at the macro environment, the organization cannot affect that macro environment, although the macro environment can hugely affect the organization, and the effect can be so huge that it can even push the organization out of business. So we discussed the different 5 forces in this, such as the power of the buyers and the power of the suppliers, and we discussed that the entry barriers, the different substitutes available, the competitive rivalry. So we discussed all these different factors, that when the buyer is more powerful, or when is the bargaining power higher of the buyer, and when is the supplier more powerful, when is the bargaining power of the supplier greater, and what can be the different barriers to the entry of the new entrants in the organization, and if you're a new entrant, what strategy you can adopt to overcome those barriers, right? And we also discussed the concept of the substitutes, that how those substitutes can be a challenge for the organization, and your competitor or some new entrant can come in the industry with bringing in all together with bringing a complete substitute product for your product, such as the tea for coffee. Right, and then we also had a discussion on the strategic groups, that the competitive environment or the direct competitors in the organization, and we discussed that the industry in which the organization is operating, all the industry is not the direct competitor of the organization, because some of the firms in the industry, they might be very huge, and they might be having different strategic customers, right? So they might be having very niche strategic customers, and the clientele might be very much niche, right? And they might be producing very high quality goods and charging very premium price, such as if I give you an example of a big superstore and that of a corner store. So they both are into the retailing business, the big superstore and the small corner store. Right, they're both in the retailing business, but their target market is different, right? Their strategic customers are different, their locations are different, the strategic locations are different, right? The corner store, it may not be having the goods of very good quality goods, right? And it may not be at a very important or very key location, right? Very strategic location, right? And so its customer base would be different, right? The product range and the values of the products that would be different compared to the products that are available in the big superstore, right? So this is how the strategic they fall into the strategic groups are the ones wherein who are in the same line of business, and who have the similar customers, who have similar products, or using similar technology. So there are similarities on a number of areas, then they come under the same strategic group, and then they are your direct competitors, because otherwise when you're doing your analysis and you're calculating your opportunities and threats, if you do not identify what your strategic group is, wherein you fall, then that analysis that you carry, it may mislead you, because you might be getting data from the very big retailers and very big store owners, and but they are not your direct competitors, and that data, if you make that data as benchmark, then that would be really misleading for you, and that can lead to great harm than benefits, right? So therefore it is important to identify that what is your strategic group and who are your direct competitors, what strategy they are adopting, what you are adopting, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are the different opportunities and threats from the external market. So you need to make all this this analysis in a coherent way, and you have to identify what your strategic groups are. So the importance of strategic groups is really important, and we discussed this. And then during the lecture 4, we had a discussion on the internal environment of the organization, and we saw that as opposed to the external environment, whose focus was that try to scan the environment and try to analyze that what are the different forces in the external environment that are influencing you, how you have to deal with those external forces, and that view basically really focused on the external environment and how you have to deal with that environment, right? During the lecture 4, the resource-based view was discussed, and this view basically emphasized that it's not only the industrial environment, or it's not only the external environment that is important, although you need to have information on the external environment, on the opportunities and threats, but you also need to know what are your strengths and weaknesses, right? So this view basically stated that it's an organization can gain competitive advantage, but for the sustaining of that competitive advantage, it can only be sustained through the human resources of the organization, right? So so it termed those the internal resources and the strengths. The view emphasized that the organization needs to identify its strengths and weaknesses, and it needs to have its resources, the internal resources. It needs to identify its internal resources that are its strengths, and those strengths can be capitalized and they can give sustainable competitive advantage to the organization, right? So basically this internal audit and this view, they divide the resources into the threshold resources and the threshold competencies. Threshold resources are the resources which are required for the firm to keep going in the line of business. So if it does not have those resources, such as if it does not have the key basic infrastructure, it does not have the basic machinery, if it does not have the basic plants, they are all the threshold resources, right? If it does not have them, then it of course cannot be staying in the line of business. If it does not have a plant, it does not have a physical existence, they're all the threshold resources, right? And the threshold competencies are those processes which are the minimum requirements to run those resources, right? So to deploy those resources, the processes which are used to deploy the resources, they are the threshold competencies, and these threshold resources and threshold competencies, they are required for the firm to stay in business. But for a firm to gain competitive advantage, it needs to have unique resources and core competencies. So the unique resources are the one that not all firms have, right? So such as the one firm, if the two firms, they both have the plants, but one firm's plant is on a strategic location, then that is a unique resource of that firm, right? And a library having the very classical books, that can be a unique resource for that library, because that may not be available in every library, right? And then it needs to have some core competencies, right, which are again those processes which are utilized to deploy the unique resources, right? So the firm needs to have the robustness of the strategic capabilities. So strategic capabilities are the unique resources and the core competencies in together. When they are robust, then the firm can sustain competitive advantage. And for the robustness, we discussed that the resources of the firms, they need to be they need to be rare and not easily available. They need to be not imitable, right? We discussed that if they are immutable resources, then again they need to be scarce. Right, so we discussed a number of factors that can determine the robustness of the strategic capability. So if unless and until the strategic capability is robust, the firm cannot sustain competitive advantage, right? And the robustness of strategic capabilities also ensures that the firm's core competencies do not turn into the core rigidities, right? And then we discussed the benefits of the value chain. We discussed basically the value chain analysis in detail, the different components of the value chain, and we discussed that why we perform this value chain analysis. We saw that it's the firm gets to know at all the different points, such as during the inbound logistics and the outbound logistics and the operations, and at all the different stages in the value chain, how the firm needs to identify what are the costs of the firm at all these different stages, and what are the benefits that the firm is getting at all these, what is the added value that the firm is getting at the different steps. So it is a breakdown basically of the firm's operations from the input gathering to the till the final sales have been made to the customers, right? So at all the different steps in this value chain, at every step the value is being added, but is that value worth the cost or not? And then you compare this value chain with the value chains of your competitors, and you then try to see the cost. You calculate this cost benefit ratios of your firm at all these different points with that of your competitors at all the different points, and then you can get to know that what are your relative strengths and weaknesses, and what are your competitors' strengths and weaknesses, and what policy you need to adopt, whether you need to outsource or not. That decision, the value chain analysis, that really can help you make that decision. So the areas in which you are incurring more cost and the value added is not that much, and your competitor, you also see that your competitor has lower costs than the cost that you have at that step, then you can outsource that step. It means that you are not strong in that step, so you can outsource that activity from some external organization who can do that same work for you at a cheaper rate. And then we also discussed the concept of the activity maps, wherein we saw that how the organizations, they can basically identify their key strengths and their key weaknesses by doing this activity mapping thing, right? By putting, because sometimes the firms, they have some competitive advantage, they have certain strengths, they have certain core competencies, but it is difficult for them, the managers themselves, because of the causal ambiguity that occurs in the organization, and it becomes difficult for the managers to identify that what is causing what, and how the things are happening, and what are the processes, and which processes are giving the competitive advantage to the company. So the activity mapping is done to identify that what are the different processes and what are the different steps, and how you write down minutely on a stick-on or anything, that how your different processes and different steps and activities are being performed in the organization, and then you map those activities in order to see and in order to find out the core competencies of the companies and the strengths of the companies and the weaknesses. Then we saw that this quantitative analysis can really help the firm doing this the analysis of its internal strengths and weaknesses, this internal analysis, right? The balanced scorecard is a very good approach to do this. And we also discussed that different financial ratios that can also give you an idea of how the organization is performing and what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the organization. Then we discussed this strategic human resource management, and we saw that how the organization, it needs to manage strategically, that is its human resource management goals and objectives and strategy that should be in line with the corporate strategy of the organization. We know that the corporate strategy of the organization is to increase the firm's performance, right? And to increase the in order to increase the performance of the firm, the strategic human resource management goal should be that it should enable the employees, or should enable to increase the employees' productivity, because that will ultimately transform them into the organizational performance, which is the key strategic corporate goal of the organization. Right. So the different the strategic HRM thus means that the human resource management policies should be in line with the corporate policies of the organization, and they should help realize the people should be managed in ways that they should help realize the corporate strategies of the organization at the higher level, right? And then we discussed a number of different goals, the critical human resource goals, and we also discussed the different tensions that are involved in the realization of those goals. We discussed two different views. One was the best practice and the other one was the best fit view, and we saw that how under the best fit view the firm it needs to develop its strategies according to the context, right? It needs to do a working on what is the context in which the organization is operating, in which industry it is operating, what are the different what is the strategy which the firm is using, and then accordingly it needs to what are the requirements, what are the goals of the firm, and then accordingly it needs to select its human resource management practices. So and the best practice view, we discussed that it is about that one size fits all. So that is the approach that is being followed in this best practice view, and it says that the best human resource practices, they are universal, and if they are adopted, those set of human resource practices, if they are adopted at any part of the world, they are going to give the firm a benefit, right? And all the firms, they can take advantage of those practices wherever those firms are, in whichever sector they are operating. So this best practice view, it completely ruled out the context from the discussion and from the theory, and it stated that one size fits all, right? And the discussion on the basis of these two approaches, we also discussed the critique of these two views. Then during our sixth lecture, we discussed the nature of the management jobs and how they create the possibility for ethical abuses, right? We discussed that what is ethical behavior, what is the importance of the code of conduct, right? And what are the common kinds of the workplace deviance, what are the different deviant behaviors, right? What is ethical decision making, how there are a number of factors that influence this ethical decision making, and in relation to this, we discussed that how ethical behavior is basically, we discussed that how the organizations, they need to have a proper code of conduct in place, which determines that what is the ethical behavior, what are the ethical ways, what are the good ways of behaving, and what are the bad ways of behaving, and what is accepted and what is not accepted, right? And the organizations that have this code of conduct, it does not mean that they are not at all unethical, but the probability and the chances and the research shows that the organizations, they tend to behave more ethically when they have a code of conduct than when they don't have a code of conduct, right? But of course, having a code of ethics cannot completely determine that the people will behave ethically as well, right? But it is important for the managers to give the trainings to the employees on how to behave ethically. It is also the responsibility of the managers, because in one of the studies, in one of the researches, it was found that from the different factors that influence the ethical decision making or the ethical behaviors of the employees, the most major influence on the ethical behavior is the organizational factors, the deadlines that are given by the organizations, and the tough targets that are given by the managers, right? So it is the manager and the organization itself that is mostly responsible for the non-ethical behavior on the part of the employees, right? So if the managers, they give realistic targets, only ambitious targets but realistic as well, then the employees, they may not feel that much stressed, and they may not perform unethically to achieve their goals and their deadlines and their targets, right? So the managers, their responsibility falls on the shoulders of the managers as well, greatly, right? And the same research that showed that the individuals, they engage into unethical behaviors in the least owing to their personal reasons, right? So for example, for getting their promotions, etc., and for taking other unethical or for taking other advantages, they engage least in the unethical behavior, right? So the greatest determinant of unethical behavior is the organizations and the managers, right, and the commitment of the management. So if the management is committed, it should reward the positive ethical behavior, and it should punish the unethical behavior, right? So there should be reinforcement, both positive and negative. Then during our next lecture, we discussed the concept of organizational stakeholders, and we distinguished between the shareholder model, and I told you the history of the shareholder model, and we also discussed the stakeholder model, and we saw that how under the shareholder model the responsibility is only to maximize the profits and giving and satisfying your shareholders. But under the stakeholder models, there are a number of stakeholders that the organization has, such as the employees, the customers, the general public, the environment, the social responsibility, and the shareholders as well. They are all the stakeholders in the organization, and the organization is responsible towards all those different stakeholders, right? And it should fulfill its duties, its responsibilities towards all those different stakeholders. Then we also had a discussion on the social responsibility, that how the organization is, it needs to manage its environment, it needs to have an understanding of the environmental management, and it needs to perform in ways that are socially ethical and that are socially responsible ways, right? And then we discussed the costs and the different costs and the benefits of planning. We discussed the top level, medium level, and the bottom level plans. We also discussed the special purpose plans and for change, for contingencies, and the product development processes. During our 8th lecture, we had a discussion on basically the rational decision making. We discussed the difference between this bounded rationality and the rational decision making, and we saw that how the managers, when they have to make certain decisions, how they first have to identify the problems, then how they have to see that what are the different alternatives to solve those problems, then they have to give the weightage to all those different alternatives, and they have to evaluate those all the different alternatives that are available to solve the problem, and they have to prioritize those alternatives, and then they have to make selection of the alternatives which are the most suitable ones, the most suitable choices, and then they arrive at the rational decisions basing on the data that they have collected, right? But in reality, we discussed that the rational decision making does not happen. It's not possible because of a number of constraints that the managers face in terms of the time, and in terms of the money that is involved, and also in terms of the limited analytical approach that the managers have. So if they get all the possible information on a problem, right, and scanning and analyzing and processing that information is not possible for the manager, and the manager is not, we do not expect from the manager that he is aware of on all the different areas. He has full command and knowledge, and he can make his analysis correct by gathering all the information. So managers, they also have the limited analytical skills, and they have limited the information, and they also have the limited time, and they also have the limited information, because to collect all the information on a particular problem is also not possible. So what the managers do is that they try to get as much information as they can, and on the basis of that information they make certain decisions, right? And that is the bounded rationality. Then we also discussed that how the decision making can be improved, and how group decisions and group decision making techniques can improve decision making, right? Because when you enter into this group decision making, we had a discussion that how this group decision making can basically enhance the probability, because it can give more diversity, and it can give more ideas, and as a result it can challenge the status quo, it can challenge the existing assumptions, and it can be more participatory as well on the part of the group members, and as a result the decision making, it can improve, right? Then we have a discussion on the functions of communication, and the different communication process and the model. We discussed that how the communication is both is downward, how it is upward, and the lateral communication. So we also discussed that the verbal, written, and non-verbal communication, what are the difference between these different forms of the communication, and how the verbal communication is most rich, and how you get very quick feedback on the verbal communication, whereas that the feedback is not quick from the the written communication, when you're sending emails or when you're writing memos, then the language and the way that information is decoded by the listener or by the viewer, right, that is not very much rich in the written communication as it is in the verbal communication, where you get instant feedback, right, and instant and overt feedback, whereas in written communication sometimes you can wrongly decode the data, and because of the noise, because of the lack of the richness of that channel of email, etc., right. And we also discussed the non-verbal communication, which is by way of your body gestures or by way of your body language, such as if you're coming if your supervisor is coming close to you and then talking to you, it gives a sense of closeness, right, and it is a non-verbal gesture which can be taken as a good gesture for the employee or for the subordinate, right. And for instance, you're asking an employee that not come to your office yet, or you don't have time yet because you have a meeting, right, but you are telling it in smiling in a pleasant way, that will give a different meaning. And if you are saying that, okay, let's have a meeting, but you're saying it in an angry way or in a not so willing way, then that will give a different meaning. So this is how the non-verbal communication can change the decoding of the message, right. Then the formal communication networks, we had a discussion on those. We had a discussion on grapevine, that how the employees, they enter into grapevine when there are a number of rumors about the things that are important to the employees, and when they are not being disclosed by the managers, and those rumors, they spread in the organization, among the employees, and what are the consequences of this grapevine, how this grapevine it can be avoided, what are the steps that the managers can take. Then we discussed the choice of channels and the channel richness. We saw that which channels they should be chosen, when which channels should be chosen, right. So for example, if you have to to terminate an employee, of course you should not do it by way of email, but you should do it by way of a personal call, and you should do it verbally by face-to-face interview with the employee, right. So it depends upon the nature of the job. So if it is a routine task, if it is a routine notification, then it can just be through an office memo, it can just be through an email. But if it is something of important, of strategic nature, then it should be communicated verbally, so that the people, you can get immediate feedback of the people, as well as you can you can get to know the reactions of the people and the messages given to the employees, and you can make sure that it is decoded by the employees in the right way. So when it is a non-routine activity, you should prefer the verbal communication sources. Then we discussed the common barriers to effective communication. And lastly, we discussed the culture as effective communication barrier, right. That we discussed that how the different culture is the moderator in this communication process, right. And we discussed the role of the culture in this communication process. Then for our 10th lecture, we discussed the concept of the motivation, and we discussed a number of theories of motivation, by starting off from the Maslow's need theory, which divides the which gives a hierarchy of needs of the individuals, right, and starting from the basic needs and ending up to the need for self-actualization. It gives the 5 different levels of the needs, and the theory states that the individual satisfies the lowest level needs first, the basic needs, the safety and the security needs, and the health and the food needs, and then it needs to meet its social needs, the need for affiliation, etc., and then it moves to the need for self-actualization, etc. Unless and until the individual covers the lower steps in the hierarchy, it cannot move up the hierarchy, right. So then we discuss the ERG theory, which is the theory of existence and relatedness and the growth, which is similar to the Maslow's theory, except for that the theories said that the individual can pursue all these his needs or desires on all these 3 different aspects simultaneously as well. But these theories, of course, they don't have much research support, or they don't have much empirical support, because of the difficulty in gathering and checking, gathering data on these different aspects and checking that. Then we discussed the theory X and theory Y, that how under theory X and the managers, they believe or they assume that the people they are they don't want to work and they're not hardworking, and under the theory Y, the managers assume that the people love work and they are very hardworking, and therefore the environment should be very conducive for the people to do their work, and the jobs should be enriched. Then we discussed the two-factor theory, which was given by Herzberg, and how we discussed that how this theory, it distinguished between the factors that are the job satisfiers, and between the factors or the motivating factors, and the factors that are absence of which will lead to job dissatisfaction, right? And they are the hygiene factors. We also discussed the McClelland's theory of needs, and we discussed the cognitive evaluations theory, and we discussed that how the importance of this cognitive evaluations theory, which distinguished between the extrinsic and the intrinsic motivation in such a way that if the employees, they are given the rewards and the extrinsic benefits for doing something, for doing some activity, then the intrinsic motivation for doing that activity will be diminished, or it will be reduced, right? So it was an interesting theory, and it gains and gathers a very important place in the contemporary theories on motivation. Then we discussed the goal setting theory, wherein we saw that how the very smart and realistic goals and ambitious goals, they need to be set in the organization for the employees to be motivated. So the challenging goals, they are themselves motivating for the employees. Then we had a discussion on the self-efficacy theory, which stated that how the individuals' perceptions about themselves, on how they can perform, how well they can perform under different situations, that can be the motivating factors for the individuals. So if they are highly self-efficacious and they believe that in their capacities to perform well under different situations, then it improves their motivation to get the task done. And we also discussed a number of determinants of this self-efficacy, which is a partly stable personality trait of the individuals. We saw that how the expectations of your managers, they can that you can perform a job that can enhance, actually, which is the self-prophecy theorem as well. We saw that how the higher expectations from the manager can actually lead to higher performance of the subordinate, and the lower expectations of the manager from yourself and the lower targets of the managers for you to perform can reduce your performance, actually, right? And how your co-workers or someone other who is performing the same job, if he's doing it really well and you have the same features as that individual has, it increases your self-efficacy, that okay, if that someone is doing it, I can also do it. Or your co-worker saying to you, praising you and saying you that you have been doing it really well in the past and you can also do it in the future, then that also increases your efficacy, that you can actually do it. So we also had a discussion on the implications of all these different theories for the managers. That how what are the implications of these different what are their strengths, their weaknesses, their limitations, their drawbacks, and how managers can benefit from all these different theories, how the managers, they need to understand the different motivations of the individuals, and if because unless and until they understand the different motivations of the individuals, why they are working, how they are working, what is motivating them, what is demotivating them, and then they need to customize their human resource management practices according to the motivations of the individuals. If they want, they understand the motivations of the individuals, how the behaviors of the individuals are formed, how the attitudes of the individuals are formed, what derives their behavior, what drives their attitudes. Unless and until the managers won't understand that, it would be difficult for them to bring in the true interventions that can really motivate the employees and that can extract positive behaviors from the employees. So that was it for today. I hope you enjoyed listening today's lecture, which was just actually a recap of what we have done so far. I tried to touch the important points on what we have done so far, so that you have actually a cohesive and a coherent view, a conceptual view of what we have done. So see you again. Thank you very much.